Hello everyone and welcome to our fourth and final Clinikids Autism Seminar Series. My name is Andrew Whitehouse and I'm really lucky to be joined by my dear colleague Sarah Pillar, and we're presenting today on the 5 tips to helping autistic kids communicate. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to this all day, so we're going to get stuck into it. I'll let you know the format that we'll be doing it, but really today what we want to do is provide you a bit of an understanding of the science, and then also some more clinical knowledge around how we can best help kids communicate their wants, needs, desires, to help kids be whoever they want to be. So we're really looking forward to it. Before anything, we always start with an acknowledgement of country. So, right there. Thank you. Now you can see, before we start, we always start with an acknowledgement of country. So we're in Perth, Western Australia, so we'd like to sort of acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and to acknowledge elders past, present, and all Aboriginal people on the call today. Also acknowledging the lands on which you're on, and thank you so much for your attendance today. So, my name's Andrew Whitehouse. I'm lucky enough to head up the Clinikids Autism research team over at the Kids Institute in Western Australia. Sarah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Sarah Pillar. I feel very lucky to get to work in Andrew's team. I'm a speech pathologist by background, but I'm the research development manager within the team.
At Clinikids, we're a team of around 65 clinicians and researchers who really our aim is to find new ways to help support kids to be whoever they want to be, and a key part of that is communication, which is what we're going to be talking to today. So some housekeeping. Firstly, it's going to go for an hour today. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be answering questions for about 15 minutes. You can ask questions, as it says on the slide there, through the question and answer button or Q&A button in Teams. We're going to be answering as many questions, and I can tell you that no question is off limits, so please do ask those questions and we'll make sure that we'll get through as many as possible. We're going to be recording the seminar, okay, but we won't be recording the Q&A, so just so you have that, an awareness of that. All right, so let's talk about the talk. So I'm going to be doing the first bit. I'm going to be setting the scene of science. Now, I've had an absolute ball going back through the science to look at what I can present to you today. And really, I'm going to provide you some of the biology that underpins how kids develop, and brain development in particular, and how that might relate to the development of neurodivergence. Then I'm going to throw to Sarah, and Sarah's going to be talking to you, providing you some more practical knowledge about how we can better support autistic kids to communicate. Then there's the Q&A time with an exclamation mark, so then we must be excited. Okay, look, this is the first bit. Let's talk about science. Now, you cannot talk about science without understanding the history of where we've come from in the context of autism. And that all started, well, many, many moons ago, but really the first description of autism in the sort of Western canon is from Leo Kanner in 1943. Now, he was the first to observe and then write about it and publish publicly an observation around children, it was 10 or 12 children, who were all developing differently, but developing differently in a really particular way. And what his innovation was to sort of identify that this group of children might all be part of a collection that we might call a syndrome, or it might be a disorder or a difference. And that was when he defined or used the first term, autism. Now, right from that very first description of autism, there were some really key aspects around communication that Kanner identified. So the first thing was really delayed or absent speech. And it was very clear that it didn't develop language at typical age or spoke very little. Echolalia was a very key part of how we used to identify autism. So echolalia, of course, is repeating words or phrases that somebody might have heard previously, and often it's thought to be presenting or repeating those words without really computing what children or what people might be saying. There's a reevaluation of that theory going on right now, which is a really interesting context, but I'm not going to go into it too much here. Interestingly, right from the very first description, Leo Kanner describes something called pronoun reversal, which you might recognise in your own day-to-day lives or within your clinical life if you're a clinician. And it's when children might be saying you when referring to themselves instead of I, or perhaps even the reverse. And then the other one was the literal interpretation, which a lot of people outside of this call tonight might actually know a bit about, because it seems to be one of the things that is associated within the community around autism. The one that's sort of talked about a lot is the idea of crying your eyes out, and children might be horrified if you sort of say that to them. Obviously, that's not what it means to cry a lot, but the idea of literal interpretation. Now, at 1943, autism wasn't a diagnostic category. This was a scientific paper that kind of said, actually, this seems to be a group of children all with a similar cluster of behaviours. Autism was not introduced into our diagnostic sort of framework until 1980, and that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is sort of the, it's often called the Bible, but it's really the dictionary of what describes of how we identify different conditions. So it says that these are the kind of behaviours that are required for somebody to receive this diagnosis. And that occurred in the 3rd edition of the manual in 1980. Interestingly, here are the diagnostic criteria back in 1980, and what you'll see there, those are the 3 that relate to communication, and they are very, very similar to the first description of Leo Kanner's in 1943. So 37 years later, I think I got that right, 37 years later, it was still quite consistent with that very first description. Now, I can tell you that clinically speaking, look, I just want for the record, I was born in 1981, but actually this was still in effect when I started working clinically many, many years later. And actually this was really quite a very common way in which we interpreted or understood who autistic kids were, that actually it was children who had quite significant delays or even an absence of verbal language. And really that was a key part of our diagnostic criteria all the way into the 1990s. Of course, what happened after that is that there was a huge, once autism was in the diagnostic manual, there was an explosion of research, a real, it really was a tidal wave of research that happened. And we started to understand that actually children and in fact people can have those core diagnostic behaviours of autism, a social communication difference and restricted and repetitive behaviours, but actually develop language quite well, and in fact be very well advanced at language, but there is something different about the use of language. And so that difference translated into our 4th edition of the manual, which was published in 1994. And along came the idea of 3 core domains of autism. Now, some of the clinicians on the call will absolutely remember this, and even parents who might have older kids will remember, or older adults might remember this. There was the social domain, that there were differences in social ability. There was the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviours, but importantly, there was its own domain of communication, and communication, differences in communication were a key diagnostic feature. And here I've just pulled out the diagnostic criteria in the 4th edition of the manual that related to autism. Now, what you'll see there is, I really want you to look at the criteria A and B. You'll see that criteria A is still there. That is very much, in fact, it's almost word for word the wording that was used by Leo Kanner back in 1943. So that still remained, but that B item came along, that actually there are individuals, and not just kids, but also adults, and that was a really important evolution as well. We just don't diagnose kids. Actually, adults can present with these behaviours as well that might have really high levels of verbal language, but might actually express that very differently. Of course, the research tidal wave continued, and then we went from 1994, the 4th edition, to 2013, the 5th edition of the manual, and that was published, and that's the one that we still currently use now in terms of the diagnosis of autism. And the most important thing for you to understand is that restricted and repetitive behaviours domain, that still remains, and there are core sort of behaviours that we observe that are part of that diagnosis, but actually the social and communication domains, which were different which were separate in the 4th edition, they actually were combined. Now, speaking with people who were part of the panel that developed this diagnostic criteria, the view was that you can't take the social out of communication and you can't take the communication as out of social. And so it made no sense to have these as separate domains, and these were then combined into the one domain. So we went from a triad of differences to a dyad of differences. And these are the sort of three behaviours that relate to communication in the context of autism for DSM-5. And that is, there they are there. But the most important thing is that you'll see is the word ranging. Ranging is in each of these differences and criteria, which indicates that there is great variability between different individuals, and that individuals can still meet criteria for autism, but be quite different within those domains. So here we are now in 2024, and how do we view, what's the current status of language and communication in the context of autism in 2024? First thing to say is that we recognise very clearly that all kids communicate, and Sarah's going to talk to you a bit more about that in a bit. It's absolutely clear that not all kids may communicate verbally, but all kids, right from the time they come out of the womb and enter this big wide world, they are communicating with us. It might be through their voice. Firstly, it might be through words. It might be, maybe not straight out of the womb, but they might be communicating with words. They'll be communicating with their voice. They'll be communicating with their body language. They're communicating with their eyes. They communicate a lot. Every child communicates, but we do understand there is a large range in the ways that people communicate, or at least their dominant way to communicate. What we do know in the context of autism, just a bit of a snapshot as it currently exists in 2024, is that at 5 years of age, and there was a fantastic sort of study by Rose and David Trembath and a few others that found that actually this is the kind of breakdown that we see. That at 5 years of age, so probably if you think about at the time that kids enter into school age, there is still a predominant, or at least a large number of kids who have a diagnosis of autism, who are minimally verbal and still communicate, but communicate through other means. But in terms of verbal language, quite minimal. Another proportion, 25 to 35%, that have limited verbal language, and then 25 to 30% who are quite fluent or verbal. Some of that might surprise you, and it certainly surprised me when I came across this paper many years ago, but that's generally the proportion that we're seeing in terms of the verbal abilities. So how do we view autism in 2024? The way that I believe that the majority of the field conceptualises communication differences is both a difference and a disability. We absolutely understand that kids are born with neurological differences, and that shapes not just how people experience the world, but also how they communicate with the world. And of course, communication is that back and forth interaction. And so if people are experiencing the world in a certain way, they will also interact with the world in a different way. At the same time, that those differences within the world that we have around us can be a disability, both through innate biological limitations in terms of maybe not being able to communicate verbally in a world that communicates verbally, but also in the way that our society fails to accommodate these differences. And my view is quite strong, is that both difference and disability can coexist together, because number one, it celebrates people for who they are. All kids are born beautiful, but it also says that actually we have a constant responsibility upon ourselves to support those innate differences so that kid can be whoever they want to be. All right, this is where I get super nerdy. I'm going to go for another 10 minutes. How does that sound to you? Okay. Fantastic. Okay. Super nerdy, because I really want to go back into some of the biology. Now, it can often be a little bit challenging to talk about biology, because what it does is it takes us away from this beautiful child or adult in front of us, and takes us back to some of the, takes us away from what we're trying to do and how we support. But I can tell you, I am asked constantly, and in a really engaging way, what are these biological differences that might lead to kids receiving a diagnosis of autism? And so I was really keen to talk to you about it today. So this is a very, 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 very simple, but hey, I'm quite simple myself, very simple schematic that helps you understand the pathway from genetic differences through to brain development. So as you know, we're all born with unique DNA, which makes us all different, except for identical twins, and we're going to get into that actually, but actually the way that those genes are expressed is very different between identical twins as well. So our genetic architecture really dictates the way that our brain develops. It dictates where and how many neurons form and at what time, so brain cells form. It also determines which neural connections might form with each other. And so all of a sudden, these genes, which are the blueprint for how the brain develops, is starting to actually knit together a brain as in utero that then guides our behaviour outside of the womb as well. So it's very clear we have DNA which comes together at the point of conception, expresses as the baby develops within the womb. We see that the blueprint of the genes start to tell the neurons when to develop, how to develop, which connections to form, and then outside of the womb that the brain is formed, and away we go. So a couple of interesting, really interesting stats is that the brain goes from 25% to 90% of the adult's brain size from birth to age 3. So 25% of an adult brain size at birth to 90% at age 3. And there are moments throughout there that the baby is forming 1 million neural connections per second. The speed and is breathtaking of brain development in those first 3 years of life. And anyone who's actually on the behavioural level watched a child develop language just understands what an absolute miracle and just a feat that brain can manage at that time. God, I wish I had that brain now, let me tell you. But it's truly extraordinary what happens. Now let's talk genetics, because people get really interested in this. Aren't genetics a blueprint and you can't change it? Let me try and break down genetics a little bit, because it's really quite interesting. So how do we know that autism is linked to genetics? We can find this through a number of ways, but the easiest way that we can describe this is through twin studies. And so that's what I wanted to describe to you tonight. So there are two different types of twins, as we know. There are identical twins. These are the people on your left. And then there are fraternal twins of people on your right. Now, the two sets of twins provide what we call a natural experiment to actually understand what might be genetically associated traits. Now, twin studies are used for all sorts of things, for hair colour, for height, for everything, and it also has been used in the concept of to understand autism. So, what's important to understand about these two different sets of twins? The first thing is that identical twins, if they're raised in the same house, they share 100% their environment, because generally speaking, they're going to be parented the same, they have the same environmental exposures, they go to the same school, etc., etc., etc. These are the things that can make kids' development go differently, of course, as we know. Importantly, though, identical twins share 100% of their DNA. They are identical in their DNA as well. What about fraternal twins? They're still twins, so they grew up in the same womb. Well, not really grew up, didn't grow up that much in there, but they were in the same womb together. Well, if they were raised in the same house, they still had 100% of the DNA, similar to the identical twins, 100% of the environment, similar to the identical twins, because they had the same parents, went to the same school, etc., etc. But they only share on average about 50% of their DNA with their co-twin. And that's just like typical siblings, share on average about 50% of the DNA with their co-twin. And that provides us a really awesome natural experiment. So what we do to understand whether something has a genetic basis or not, we go to an area. So it could be the whole of Australia if you're in Australia. Usually it's a little bit smaller, like a state, for example. So I'll use Victoria as a state at the moment. What we do is we go to the whole of Victoria and say, let's find all the twins in that area, identical or fraternal twins, where one or both of the twins have a diagnosis of autism. And then what we do is we calculate what's called a concordance. So the concordance is the percentage chance, if one twin has autism, what's the percentage chance that the other twin has autism? Now, let me show you what we find. It's the other way around. What we actually find is that for fraternal twins, so these are the people on the right, what we find is that fraternal twins, if one twin has autism, there's about a 5 to 18% chance that the other twin will also have autism. if for identical twins, what do we find out? We find out that actually there is if one twin has autism, there's a 60 to 80% chance that the other twin has autism. Now, again, what's the difference between the two different types of twins? Is the amount of genetic material that they share. And given that identical twins share all of their DNA and they have a higher concordance of autism compared to fraternal twins, we understand that autism must be associated with differences in genetics. So that's the first bit. And our first discovery of that was around 1977, where the first twin study of autism was conducted. And all of a sudden, it was a revolution that actually we understand that differences in development that may lead to an autism diagnosis come from a genetic basis. Okay. Now, this is super nerdy. Here I go. Okay, so what do we do then? So obviously, genetics are not twins. Okay, genetics are little molecules, DNA-based pairs. Now, what we do to understand differences in genetics, and this is super nerdy, is that we might take some DNA from an individual. Now, how do we do that? Well, we can do it through a saliva swab. So you might have had that done. It can happen through the taking of blood. And essentially what happens is you extract that DNA and then you put it into a machine like that. That's a DNA sequencer there, and that's actually a lot of DNA sequencing there. And what that then does is it spits out, spits out's probably not right. It gives you a whole lot of data, okay? The data are essentially these chromosomes. But what it does, it tells you all of the 3 billion differences, 3 billion with a B differences that exist within all of our differences in genetics. And then you get a nerd like me, or someone even nerdier than me, believe it or not, to go look at that and to understand, are there any differences in those genetics that might be more associated with autism or not? And that's essentially how we break down to understand what in those 3 billion genetic differences might be related to autism. Now, there are two different types of differences that are often found. The first one is called de novo differences. Now, that just means create new, from new. And that essentially means that the genetic difference in a person diagnosed with autism is not present in the mum or the dad, but it is present in that child. Now, that can be created due to differences, for example, in the sperm or the egg, but it's not present in the mum or the dad, or it might be simply created at the point where the sperm and the egg meet. Now, we find that about 15%, maybe even a bit less, 15% of children might have a de novo difference that might lead to their brain developing differently. The vast majority, though, is what we think is called common variation, which are small differences one way or the other that we all have in our DNA, all of us. But when 5, 6, 10, 30, whatever it might be, all come together in the same individual, that's when brain development starts to go a little bit differently. Okay, so there are two different types, de novo or common variation. Now, what we do know is that genetic technology has come along a lot, okay? And genetic technology now tells us that we can identify genetic differences that lead the brain to develop differently in about 15 to 20% of children or people who have a diagnosis of autism. And that figure is slowly increasing every year as we find out more about genetics. Now, I don't expect you to understand this, but this is essentially me trying to tell you that it's really complex. So up the top, those horizontal lines that you see here, they're each of the chromosomes sort of laid out. Now, of course, there are millions upon millions of genetic differences in there. It's a very simple diagram. But what you need to know is that all of those red things that have been highlighted, they're different genes. Okay, they're different genes that have been identified and have been found to be related to autism. What I've then done is I've created this, and these are essentially genes that we know are also related to communication development in humans more broadly. And what you'll see is there's a significant overlap between the two. Importantly to say that not all of these genetic differences will be identified in every child, and in fact, it's almost certain that these genetic differences will never be the same in two different people. Okay, but all I'm wanting to show you here is that there are a lot of genes that have been identified that might be related to autism, but also there's a lot of overlap in terms of the communication genes that we know about as well. Okay, neurology. Now I'm getting to the end of my section here. Neurology is really cool, and I spend a great deal of my professional life looking at it. We do know, and it's been known for actually centuries, is that there are two key areas of the brain that relate to communication. The first one is Broca's area. You remember that?
I do.
You do, of course you do. This is sort of drummed into every speech pathologist during their training. Broca's area is in your parietal lobe, and it's related to speech production. So if there are differences within that area, your speech production, your ability to produce verbal language will be different. We also have another area, Wernicke's area, and that is related to speech comprehension, our understanding of speech. And these are two very clear areas. This is shown on the left hemisphere, and certainly in the majority of people, we do see these centres concentrated in the left hemisphere, but not exclusively for all people. That's an important point. Now, neurology can differ the brain can differ between different people in all sorts of amazing, cool ways, okay? Number one, the structure. So that is the shape and size of the brain. We all have differences in our brain size and in different areas, and it's, part of what makes us us. Also in the way that it functions, the way that different parts of the brain, how one part of the brain might communicate with itself, or the way that different parts of the brains communicate with each other. That differs all between different people, and related to genetics and related to experience. And the other thing is connectivity, which again, it goes down to the really molecular level about how, if this part of the brain wants to talk with this part of the brain, how does it do it? Does it take a very quick route? Does it take a route via a different part of the brain, and even much more complex on a very small chemical level as well? We've had really intriguing leads. Now, I didn't do a deep dive on this, but what I did do is identify one study that I remember thinking, this is a really cool study, and I'd love people to know about it. So this is about the amygdala. The amygdala is an almond shape. It's sort of the etymology, the origin of the word is around almond. So it's a tiny almond shape structure right deep in the brain. And it's around emotion processing. Now, what this study did is it followed 260 siblings of autistic children. Now, they followed siblings because we know that those kids are more likely to receive a diagnosis of autism. And they followed them from birth. Okay, and then provided MRI scans from 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months of age. Now, what they found is that at 24 months of age, 58 of those kids received a diagnosis of autism, and around 212 kids didn't. And so all of a sudden, they had all this incredible data that about the brain size and brain shape of kids who went on to develop very early in life, who went on to develop autism. Now, I don't expect you to understand this graph in any detail because I'm going to go quite quick. All you need to know is that vertical axis, so going from low to high, is the size of the amygdala, okay? And there are different groups. I want you to pay attention to the red and the purple. And the important thing is that at 6 months of age, the red group, which is those children who were later diagnosed with autism, they had about the same size amygdala as those children who didn't go on to have a diagnosis of autism. But then if the researchers followed these kids up to age 24 months, and what they found was really, really interesting, is found that actually a difference in the size of the amygdala emerged over time, where those kids who had a diagnosis of autism had quite a considerably larger amygdala compared to those who didn't. Now, the cool bit comes in here, is actually the rate of growth. So it was those kids who had a significantly accelerated growth in the amygdala between 6 and 24 months of age. They were the kids who had more significant characteristics of autism, so had more significant disability. So really what it's indicating is that it's not about any one time point. It's about how does the brain develop together over time, and maybe that might be related to some of the emergence of the behavioural characteristics. Now, of course, really important thing to say is that all of this is so preliminary, and it really bears no influence on day-to-day clinical practice and your children. What it does is it starts to help us to understand the differences between kids, and the important thing to say is there's significant variation, and we now know that there is no one autism, there are autisms plural. And that is as true at the behavioural level as all the way back to the biological level. And for me, that is absolutely liberating, because it means that our focus ultimately is on the beautiful kids and adults that stand in front of us and how we can help. It's not about genes, it's not about neurology. It's about we are all different and let's take people as they come individually and what we can do to support their lives. Finally, before I throw to Sarah, how should you view all of this information? Look, I've always been searching for the right analogy in this context, and it's really hard to do that. But I've always seen it now as the rush of a river. So genetics is essentially the rush of a water flow that comes. It's going to come because this is the biology that you're born with. But our therapies, our supports, our parenting, it's about how we direct the flow of the water. That flow of the water is the beauty of who that child is. But what our support is seeking to achieve is how we direct that and direct it into the most functional way possible. All right, I'm going to go throw this to Sarah now. Am I off to the next one? Thank you so much.
Awesome.
So I'm going to throw to Sarah now, and Sarah can do it. And feel free to take a bit longer.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Such an interesting deep dive into that science side of things. I'm going to be just going through the top 5 tips on a practical level for supporting autistic kids to communicate. And we're going to start off with tip 1, which is build communication partner skills. And you might have expected our first tip to have something to do with changing the child. And it can be a huge misconception that the first step to supporting a child's communication, that it's all about teaching them something, or that we should start with getting the child to change in some way. Even as a much younger speechy, I was really excited to teach kids language. But something I learned very quickly is that the first step to supporting every child's communication is to change how we act as communication partners. So, what is a communication partner? It's whoever you are communicating with. The wonderful news is that you don't need any specific qualifications. Communication is always a two-way process. And every child will and should have a variety of communication partners. And it's really important to note that being an effective communication partner is a learned skill. I think parents particularly can put a lot of pressure on themselves to naturally be this amazing communication partner, to just intuitively know what their child is communicating, even when for autistic children, these signals can be different from what we might expect, or these signals might be really subtle. I would suggest that it would be great for parents and everyone to take a bit of pressure off and say that it's okay for us all to be ongoing learners in this space. And as a child continues to grow, their communication likely will change. So we need to be flexible to learn how to match those changes. There's also wonderful tools to help us learn. And the more recent advances in kind of use of video and video feedback is incredibly effective at helping people to learn how to watch and reflect on their interaction and to become better communication partners over time. So those tools are available to support communication partners. Why does the communication partner matter? It's because, as Andrew was saying, they're fundamental to how children learn language. It's an interactive process, and the whole point of communication is that a message is passed on. And if the message has not been passed on, communication has not occurred. What are communication partner skills? So the obvious one, of course, is listening, and it comes with its buddy, understanding, because it's not just enough to listen, but it is key to understand. And I think while those ones are obvious, there's a lot more to it as well. It also involves watching. It also involves noticing, involves being available, creating space and opportunity, being inclusive, finding those moments to draw a child in, offering choices, accepting communication, even when sometimes it's a no, repeating, reinforcing, and paraphrasing. So kids often want to know that they've been understood, they've been heard, and you can do that by repeating phrases back to them, reinforcing, yes, it is a truck, or paraphrasing and expanding on what they're saying. And you can also provide information and also be a key person in clarifying. Miscommunications are going to happen, and being a good communication partner involves being supportive in clarifying when there's miscommunications happen. Okay. So these skills all play a really important role in supporting individuals to communicate, which of course is their right. Tip 2, create a communication environment rich in opportunity. Again, you might have expected that the second tip would have something to do with changing the child. But again, our next top tip is about the environment around the child and creating an environment that is rich in opportunities to foster communication. What is a communication environment? It is the context where communication is happening. It involves the where, the when, the who, the why, and what methods are available. So it's all of those things, thinking about when a child might be communicating in the morning before they go to school, who they're interacting with, what the purpose is, what methods are available. Is it just verbal? Is it vision available? The environment has a fundamental impact on communication effectiveness. So this is why it really matters. Think about how much communication context impacts us as adults. I think about how much it can throw me off personally. If I'm in an online meeting and the sound is lagged, or if the camera isn't working and I'm not getting that visual feedback, it can really throw off my communication. The environment can be a communication asset, or it can really negatively impact on communication. But this is particularly true for autistic kids. Actually, many of the points that we've made so far, you might be thinking, well, isn't this important for all kids? But one of the things that's often repeated when thinking about the idea of universal design for supporting learning is that we focus on the principles that are harmful to none and absolutely essential for some. So yes, the communication environment is important for all kids, but for some autistic kids, providing the right supportive environment is essential, and it may be the difference between no communication and communication. So why does communication environment matter? It's fundamental to the impact on communication effectiveness, supports inclusion, it supports opportunity, and it supports choice in communication method as well. So what makes the communication environment rich in opportunity? It's rich in opportunity when it's set up to make sure that a child feels safe and well regulated. So that's taking into account things like needs and preferences around sensory, things like that. There needs to be things that are interesting and motivating to the child. We want to have opportunities for the child to lead, and that means making sure that they have access to things they are motivated to interact with, explore, and communicate about. We want to ensure that there are choices, that there is possibility in the environment for the child to choose or steer the direction of the communication. It can be tempting to walk into a clinic session as a speechie with all your activities set, but you also have to have the flexibility, throw them out the window and do something different sometimes. The environment is also fundamental to making sure that multiple ways of communicating are available. And that's why I've shared this picture as well. This is an awesome communication initiative to make a rich communication environment down in the Foreshore of Busselton. And so by having this available in the environment, it's enriching that environment so that then this new method is available that wasn't previously there.
And in that context as well. So people get to practice their language in that context, which is a build. Yeah. Such
a nice inclusive initiative. Okay, tip 3, get to know the child. It's closely linked, and I've alluded it to a little bit in tip 1 and 2, but I think it's important enough to be its very own tip. Rather than bombarding you with some more dot points, I think this tip is best illustrated by a story. This is a story about a moment in my career that absolutely reinforced that getting to know a child is fundamental to supporting their communication and one of the most valuable things that you can do. For a number of years, I worked in country WA. I drove north through the wheat belt and down through the Great Southern regions. I absolutely loved it and I learned so much. But one of the best lessons I ever learned was taught to me by a 6-year-old autistic girl, who I'll call Bonnie. I was working in a country school and Bonnie had just come onto my caseload. She'd had some previous speech therapy, but at the time she was pretty minimally verbal and mostly communicated using behaviours like hand leading, but would pop out the occasional word. I had received a handover of goals, target vocabs and tasks, but Bonnie didn't seem that keen on speech therapy, and I didn't feel like I could support her without taking the time to first get to know her. I had decided to spend the first few sessions just getting to know her. The EA came along to our in-school session and seemed a little bit perplexed when I spent so much of our first 2 sessions just playing, finding out what Bonnie liked and getting to know just her. And I'll admit, at the time, I had a little bit of self-doubt of, was I doing the right thing or was I wasting valuable therapy time? Only a few weeks later, when Bonnie's IEP meeting came up, I was in a big meeting room with all the other key people who supported Bonnie. And Bonnie was sitting off to the side, playing independently while we discussed her plan for the year. In the middle of the meeting, while Bonnie was playing, one of her hair ties fell out. She picked it up, stood up, and looked around at all those people in the room, saw me, and crossed the room to come straight for me, handed me that hair tie and said, "Help." I have to say, I almost exploded with joy, and that moment has echoed in my memory ever since. We hadn't worked on her help target in a single session. In a few short weeks, I hadn't done anything magical. I had just spent the time getting to know Bonnie, and Bonnie had also gotten to know me. Bonnie knew I didn't just care about what she could do, but what I cared about who she was as well. Bonnie knew I would listen. Goals are great, targets are wonderful, but because of Bonnie, I will never second guess again the enormous value to be found in taking the time to connect and getting to know a child. So getting to know the child, what they care about, what they find fun, who they are, is valuable, vital even to effective communication development. All right, tip 4. So while there is no one size fits all, there are strategies that are repeatedly shown to be beneficial for supporting communication. And so tip 4 is all about layering in effective learning strategies. So this one is basically observe, share attention, and make your language relevant. There are so many programs that have this strategy or a flavor of this strategy embedded within them. We're talking PACT, Jasper, ESTM, like a whole variety of named and unnamed programs. This often forms the core of kind of the early sequence of pairing communication. So it involves waiting and observing first, not jumping straight in, but watching the child first, creating opportunities for joint attention, and joint attention is just sharing that attention together with the child, and then being a sensitive responder and being semantically contingent. But what does that mean? You sensitively respond to what the child is interested in, and then you use language that sounds relevant. So if the child's interested in the block, you say block. And if the child's interested in making things crash, you say crash. And that's just about providing effective language models. So this is another strategy for that effective strategy that's common to lots of different programs, that modeling communication using a variety of method, gesture, your face, symbols, pictures, and language supports a rich communication environment and provides all of those models so that then they're accessible to children. You always provide, as much as possible, models that are on the just next rung of the language ladder. So children often start learning language, they start with sounds, they move to single words, they move to 2 words, they move to 3 words, and then often explodes into sentences. But if a child is at the single word level, often if you're modeling on the next rung of the language ladder, you're modeling 2-word utterances. And finally, part of providing effective language models is using comments over questions. It's really easy to get into the habit of using questions with kids. What color is it? What's that? What do you think? Where's that? Things like that. Questions are okay, but most of our communication that we use day to day, even as adults, is comments. And if we want to model the language that we want children to use, we should be choosing comments wherever possible over questions. Okay. And finally, within this kind of area of tip 4, using effective learning strategies, using everyday moments. It can feel like a lot of pressure that there should be some big therapy appointment or that there should be something really big that we're doing, but actually language is learned in everyday moments. And it's about using the routines that you have in your day, reading a story at night, a bath before bed, and creating these rhythms of predictability and surprise. And that fosters communication. And finally, tip 5 is about putting it in context and making it meaningful. Our communication goals should encompass so much more than a child being able to say more or eat or help. In the end, these are all requests. Telling someone what you need. Being able to tell someone what you need is wonderful. It can be the first step in a child becoming a self-advocate, which is awesome. But communication is also for doing so much more. Communication is one of the most wonderful things we have as human beings, and it can be used for sharing humor, making a point or arguing, explaining thoughts and ideas, asking questions, making comments, and wondering, imagine if. When supporting your child to communicate, or if you're working with autistic children as teachers, as speechies, or in any other capacity, my final top tip is remembering to think beyond wants and needs. We want to see a world where autistic children are not just supported to communicate what they need, but they can share their perspective, their views, and their dreams.
Yeah.
So this is just a summary of those 5 top tips: building communication partner skills, creating a communication-rich environment, getting to know the child, layering in effective learning strategies, and making it meaningful. So I think it's time for our Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. That was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And just before we throw to the Q&A, I want to just let you know that all of these seminars that we've delivered, and this is the 4th in 2024, will be available more publicly soon, and we'll make sure that you're on those that are on the mailing list will receive information about that. So thank you for listening. So